right, let's get started. Thank you all very much for coming on this beautiful spring day, finally. My name is Richard Linane. I'm the Director of the Geneva Disarmament Platform. Welcome to our event on nuclear deterrence and nuclear disarmament. This is something we've been wanting to do for a long time, but it's taken a long time to get our two stars in alignment, but finally we have. Thank you both very much for coming and doing this. What we want to talk about, and just before I introduce our speakers, what we want to talk about today is nuclear deterrence and nuclear disarmament, obviously, but more specifically, how these two things go together. Because, I mean, certainly from my own perception, it's always seemed a little bit odd to me how you could talk about having nuclear deterrence and still want to have nuclear disarmament. It's a bit like saying we're going to remove the floorboards while we're standing on them. But nevertheless, it's obviously a reality. It's something we have to deal with. We have the NPT, we have the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Every country, every NGO, every academic has an opinion on how to move forward with nuclear disarmament. The good news is that, in principle at least, everyone agrees nuclear disarmament is the goal. We're all supposedly working towards a world free of nuclear weapons. Even the nuclear armed states that are outside the NPT more or less adhere in principle to this goal. So it's a question, therefore, of how we get there, and how we get there while certain countries, both nuclear weapons possessors and some of their allies, are relying on nuclear deterrence for their security. So, we've had a lot of talk about this topic. Those of you who suffered through the recent NPT PrepCom in New York will know, I mean, there's a lot of essentially talking past each other. We want to try and do something about that today, because whatever you think about humanitarian approach or deterrence or the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, if we do want to make progress towards our shared goal, we have to find a way of fitting these apparently contradictory ideas together in a way that allows us to work together towards this goal. Is this possible? I don't know. That's what we're going to try and find out today. So let me introduce our speakers. Firstly, Heather Williams, who's a lecturer in the Defence Studies Department and Centre for Science and Security Studies at King's College London. I guess many of you might have heard Heather speak in the CD yesterday on transparency, so you've probably had already an introduction. Heather has a long and distinguished record and work on nuclear policy issues, nuclear deterrence, nuclear disarmament. Most recently, she's been Specialist Advisor to the House of Lords International Relations Committee inquiry into the NPT and disarmament, which must have been just a fascinating experience. So I think really there's probably no one better qualified to have such recent immersion in all the sort of policy aspects of these questions. So we're very privileged to have Heather come and talk to us today. But I'm also very pleased to have Heather here because we hear a lot of talk about the need for dialogue, of engagement, of talking, establishing real understanding. And Heather, I think, is someone who actually walks the walk. I first met Heather not at some academic setting, but actually at an ICANN campaigners meeting, where she'd been invited and accepted in Paris to come and talk to young ICANN campaigners about nuclear deterrence. And I thought that impressed me very much at the time. It was also one of the most compelling segments of that whole training course. So engagement is what we're after. Thank you, Heather, for coming and engaging again, showing us how it's done. Benoît, also very distinguished academic record on the topic of nuclear disarmament, nuclear deterrence. Benoît holds the Junior Chair of Excellence in Security Studies at Sciences Po. He's also an affiliate of the Centre for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University and a visiting fellow with Princeton University's Program on Science and Global Security and Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. Talking about engagement, Benoît has, among other things, received a British Academy Rising Star Engagement Award in 2016. So, internationally recognised engager, two internationally recognised engagers. And what we're going to do here is it's not going to be a presentation and another presentation. It's going to be more like an interview, and I've got a set of questions that I'm going to pose to each of our panelists in turn. The questions are not something I've dreamed up. These are the questions that they have dreamed up. So I asked each of them to provide 3 questions that they would want me to ask them, and 3 questions they would want me to ask the other panelist, preferably difficult, curly questions. They've both done so, so I have 12 questions altogether. There's a bit of overlap, so we can adjust them as we go through. And once we've gone through those questions and heard their various comments, we'll of course open the floor for your questions. I hope you also have some difficult and curly questions, because we have some tremendous brain power here and I want to have it tested. The other thing we want to do today is a bit of an experiment, and that is we're experimenting with this new online, well, new for us, online tool called Slido, where we can take sort of real-time polls of audience opinions. So I'd like to invite you now, we're just going to ask this one question. You can log on and use your smartphone or laptop, whatever, just go to slido.com and you put in this ND19 as the code word, and then you can answer this question. Can bridge building between proponents of nuclear deterrence and proponents of the TPNW result in practical cooperation and progress towards shared disarmament goals? Answer yes or no. I know there's not much scope for nuance there, but what we're going to do is you answer it now. We'll have the discussion, the debate, the questions. Oh, Slido.com, NDND19 is the code. At the end of our discussion, we'll go back to the app and you can vote again, and we'll just see if anyone's perceptions or opinion has changed. It doesn't identify who's who, we'll just see the number of people who answered yes and no before and afterwards. So it's just an experiment, don't take it too seriously, we just want to see if it's a useful tool. Okay, let's get started with the questions. And I think we'll start with Benoît, if that's okay, yeah? We were in a crisis, a nuclear crisis, we could say, with Iran, and another one with North Korea, and we have to deal with those. Robert McNamara famously said that we lucked out in past crises, and many participants in the nuclear conversation use that notion of we're only here by luck. Is this more than just a rhetorical point?
So, good morning or afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your interest in the issue and for taking the time to be here. Thanks, Richard, for making this possible. Thanks, Mario, and thanks, Hazard. Good to see you again. Now, the luck question is a crucial starting point. In a lot of the work that we're doing in PRS at the Nuclear Knowledges Program is precisely to give substance to this notion. So if I could get to the slideshow, that would actually be good. Just 1 second, please. This will work, I'm confident. There, I saw it. The key element being, as the slideshow is coming to work, there we go, is that Robert McNamara is the most widely quoted person who said in the past, when he was in office during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, luck was what stood between us and nuclear war. But he's by far not the only one. Here you have a picture of General Lee Butler, but you have other Russian policy and military officials who use this notion of either luck or fortune or divine providence. But the point that I want to make, and which is the starting point of an article and of a book that I'm writing, is that the intellectual toolkit that we scholars and policymakers use to think about nuclear crisis management do not allow us to deal with this notion of luck. So we let it escape. And so either we pay tribute to it or we don't, but in the end, we can't account for it. And so we end up thinking and acting as though it doesn't matter. But I want to make the case that it does matter, because essentially, when we think about nuclear vulnerabilities, we mostly think about material vulnerabilities. And what the lock point is that there is another dimension of vulnerability, which is the epistemic dimension. That is, we may think we control more than we actually do. We may think we know more than we actually do. And at this point, you're like, oh, Benoît is yet again one of those academics. Let me show you how this matters. The choices that we're making now about modernization or choices on nuclear weapons or nuclear disarmament are bets on the future that take us all the way to 2080 or 2090 for some states. And so they bet that we know enough to kind of navigate really long periods of time. But wait, to navigate those periods of time, we're assuming that what we've had so far is this long peace, this long absence of great power war, and this is because it's exceptionally long that we can rely on it to extend it into the future. When you inject the luck problem in it, that essentially recasts the whole long peace, because then the long peace is only a chunk of times which are separated by moment in which disaster was avoided by luck. So that changes the bet on the future in terms of security and sustainability. That also allows us to think about the possibility of overconfidence. And now you're going to tell me, okay, good, how do we know if it's luck or not? And this is where I hope to convince you that scholarship is not only helpful, but it's essentially necessary, because otherwise, you wouldn't get there, because there's a need for a detour. So to define luck, you essentially define it as the opposite of control practices. You have all sorts of nuclear control practices that are aiming at preventing accidental nuclear explosions, and they do so through three secondary goals: compliant personnel, working technology, and adequate information processing. If we avoid accidents through this, then we're in a control paradigm, and that means things are good because we did things nicely. You can then single out lucky cases as the opposite of that. Lucky cases can be defined as instances in which a desired nuclear outcome, which is no accidental nuclear explosions, has been achieved in one of the three following ways: independently from control practices, thanks to the failure of control practices, or in spite of a failure of control practices. And not to be too long, I won't elaborate, but you have a little list. We already have cases of each, and we're working on further evidence. And we also need to remember that the record of past close calls is by definition incomplete. That's something I'm happy to come back to in Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Benoît. I'm very interested in your definition of luck myself, which I intend to use next time I'm in Devon. Heather, if we can turn to you now. We heard Benoît talk a little bit about the role of scholarship and academics. This whole deterrence discussion, of course, is not at all new. And if we look back at the sort of track record of scholarship and academic analysis of this issue in past decades, it's clear that the invocation of strategic stability and these kinds of questions that are used to justify deterrence today were used in the past and actually created and then powered an arms race during the Cold War. Is there not a risk of this kind of analysis doing that again? Is that what we're seeing now?
Great, thank you. If I could also just up front, thank you, Richard, so much for also being someone who's walking the walk, I hope, and I really appreciated your opening remarks. To kind of just get us started before I turn to the immediate question, I wanted to relay something that had happened at PrepCom, which some of you might have been at, where I was actually on a side event panel with Alexander Kement. And I'm guessing most of you in the room know Alexander, and probably know that Alexander and I have slightly different views on these issues. And Alexander and I did not coordinate remarks beforehand and ended up making the same line of argument. Alexander supports the BAM Treaty, I do not. I'll put that, so that's where our views differ, trying to put it into a nutshell. And Alexander and I came to the same conclusion in our remarks, which was the need for more deterrence dialogues. There's a need for both the disarmament community but also the deterrence community to talk about these issues in a more robust way. And so I really do appreciate this opportunity. And I'm also just going to take this moment to answer your question up front. How do we reconcile deterrence and disarmament? And I, as you might guess, would challenge the question because we live in a world in which both exist. Nuclear arsenals have been reduced by 90% since their height of the Cold War. We live in a world where where all countries in the NPT have made a commitment to work towards disarmament, but we also live in a world where countries continue to rely on nuclear weapons for deterrence purposes. And so my approach to these questions is that as long as nuclear weapons exist, we need to reduce the risks of their use. And that is a principle that I think we all would share. And I believe this requires an awareness of both humanitarian concerns and also security ones. And I think later on we'll get into ways to reconcile that. But now turning to this question about risks of arms races and the role of scholarship in that, we're seeing, this is the types of arms races we're seeing now, it's different than during the Cold War, I would argue. During the Cold War, we thought of arms races largely in numerical numbers and racing for who has more, and this idea of overkill or mutually assured destruction. Whereas the arms races we're seeing now are take on a more qualitative nature. We're seeing dual-use capabilities, cruise missiles, hypersonic glide vehicles, but also emerging technologies such as cyber and artificial intelligence, and in particular, the risk that these could pose to nuclear command and control and have destabilizing effects. And one example of where we're seeing this is I would point to the US 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, which calls for, as many of you know, 2 supplemental nuclear capabilities, which it describes as being a hedge against other great powers' nuclear advances. So that's kind of the world that we're looking at right now. What is the potential for scholarship for this, and how do we avoid using arguments around strategic stability to slide into another nuclear arms race? I actually think we're already seeing that scholarship emerging, and I'm particularly happy that members of Unity are in the room because my examples are largely Unity studies, to be honest. The recent Unity study on risk reduction, for example, which calls for regularized dialogues across the nuclear weapon states, such as through the P5 process. And I think we're already seeing progress in this area, such as P5 work on transparency around doctrine. And we're seeing that across all P5, including the French, as I was reminded of yesterday in the conference on disarmament. But in another Unity study by Lou Dunn, which looks at how do we reverse the slide, this calls for increased awareness about the stakes. Now, I believe that these studies and this need for awareness of stakes, it has been influenced and informed by the humanitarian impacts movement. Because the stakes of arms races, it's not just in the defense budget costs, it's also when you're talking about holding hostage hundreds of thousands of lives. And Lou Dunn also calls for reviving arms control, particularly between the US, Russia, and China, and such as military-to-military dialogues. And then kind of my final point on this would just be, I actually have a very different interpretation of Cold War literature around strategic stability, because in the Cold War, strategic stability was defined by 2 components, crisis stability and arms race stability. So I can see the argument that strategic stability was used to justify it, but strategic stability also requires avoiding arms races. And so I think that we can return to those definitions of strategic stability and try to use those arguments to actually justify and argue against arms races.
Okay, well, if I could just switch from that and pick up something you said in the earlier part of your remarks, Heather, where you kind of questioned the premise of whether deterrence and disarmament are in opposition, if you like. Let me hand that straight over to Benoît and say, are deterrence postures compatible with humanitarian concerns?
So thank you for that. So we'll move to this bit. Right. So just essentially a few observations in terms of what do we mean by humanitarian concerns. And so I just want to make essentially a few observations. The first is that if by humanitarian concerns we just mean damage limitation, then the key for deterrence would be to get below the nuclear winter threshold, given what we know about the consequences of use of low numbers of nuclear weapons in what looks like a small nuclear war between India and Pakistan. I'm going to show you evidence of that. And I'm pausing because I'm just also thinking I should have premised my talk that here I'm accepting the intellectual hijacking, which is deterrence means nuclear deterrence, which is obviously not the case. There is already a discussion to be had about deterrence of whom to do what with which means, and nuclear weapons capabilities are just part of those means. But so there's this first element of overall arsenal size. Because here, the interesting thing is, that's a study from the Union of Concerned Scientists. When we talk about the nuclear age, we're thinking Hiroshima scale. But if you just look at the existing US arsenal, you have the weapons in that arsenal vary massively in scale. So the smallest one are 1/50th of the Hiroshima kind of devastating power, and the biggest so far are 80 times Hiroshima. So there is also an element of let's keep the order of magnitude in mind. That's the point on nuclear winter, but I guess you can ask questions if you're interested in. The second element is the targeting issue in the humanitarian concerns, and that speaks to an old debate about anti-force versus anti-city targeting. And so anti-force looks better on humanitarian grounds, but that's where scholarship is required, because talking about anti-force or talking about we do not target cities, we target, for example, centers of power, we need to look at what the intended effect, the intended or unintended effects of this would be. And so we need to just face the fact that centers of power are near a populated area. So to show you the effect in the almost impossibility in the existing state of the arsenals to make nuclear deterrence practices compatible with humanitarian concerns, I just ran a simulation of what if the smallest yield weapon in the French nuclear arsenal, which would be the M51.1 missile, one warhead did hit Moscow. So it's a massive underestimation by every criterion you can think of. So by next year, the warhead that I'm talking about will be retired, and the replacement warhead will be 150 kilotons instead of 100. Second, obviously, if things escalate, we're not going to send one, right? And so one warhead on the Red Square, which is a center of power, right, has, in terms of immediate fatalities, 134,000 people. And once again, this is an underestimation because that assumes ground burst. If you take the lowest French weapon next year and you assume air burst, you get past 300,000 instant fatalities. So with those numbers, you see the difficulty to be diplomatic and to be scholarly, the almost impossibility to reconcile humanitarian concerns with current deterrence practices.
It's certainly thought-provoking. But the examples you give, Benoît, okay, one example of possible use of nuclear weapons. But I'm wondering, I mean, as you did mention, among other things, that if things escalate, it won't be just one. And I wonder if I can turn over to Heather now and just ask, how do deterrence postures differ across nuclear possessors? Are some less or more risky than others?
Sure. So I would just say, to be clear, deterrence is ethically a bit uncomfortable. When you actually think about what nuclear deterrence is, you are threatening to kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And saying that out loud should probably raise some ethical questions. But nonetheless, states' postures and reliance on nuclear weapons is determined by a combination of security environments. I certainly don't feel confident enough to tell India and Pakistan that they cannot have nuclear weapons for their security. That strikes me as also slightly unethical. So it's a combination of security concerns, costs, domestic attitudes, and also threat perceptions. And unlike Benoît, I'm not as confident in saying how a nuclear exchange will happen. I can't say for certainty that only one will be used or that more than one will be used. And so what we live in a world where states rely on nuclear deterrence. And so what we need to do is think about how to live with them as ethically as possible while we work towards disarmament. And as I said in the CD yesterday, all P5 states are making strides to improve transparency around nuclear issues and reduce risks. But I also acknowledge more can be done, particularly with states outside of the NPT. And so I would also recommend to everyone a Klingendale study about different types of risk that I think can help us start to think framing this. So the study outlines 3 different types of risk. Those include unauthorized use, unintended use, or intended use based on incorrect assumptions. And all states can do more to promote transparency so as to avoid these risks. But I also want to flag a 4th type of risk, which I think doesn't get enough attention, and is where I believe the level of nuclear risk is rising, and that's what I would refer to as intentional ambiguity. And to give one example of this is a recent study by James Acton on entanglement. And James finds how if you target conventional command and control systems, you're also targeting nuclear command and control systems. And based on this study, the idea was, well, of course, you would want to separate those systems, or you would want to build redundancy because you wouldn't want to live with that nuclear risk. But in seeing how that study has been received, quite a few military and government and deterrence experts actually argue, no, you want to keep them entangled because you want to increase the level of risk. Because if you increase that level of risk, it increases your the strength of your deterrent signal. Now, the deterrence logic might support this, but I consider that to be extremely risky and a really dangerous direction that perhaps all nuclear possessors are moving towards. And so that's a type of risk that I think we can address to prevent accidental or intended nuclear escalation.
Okay, I want to move on a little bit now, having talked about risks and humanitarian aspects, to the role of scholarship, since we have scholars with us. We quite often have academics speak at meetings, but not as often as we have policymakers or government representatives. But Benoît, I mean, what do you think scholarship can actually offer? What can it do for diplomats involved in disarmament discussions?
Okay, so just one quick, to make sure that my previous point wasn't misunderstood. I'm not telling you for sure that I know how a nuclear conflict will unfold. No, what I presented is this is the most minimalist scenario for the effects of an escalation past the nuclear threshold. What I showed is the smallest type of effects, given that humanitarian concerns are about minimizing casualties to civilians. Of course, it will not happen like that, and of course, no one can tell you how it will happen and what the effects would be. The one thing I can claim for sure is that if any nuclear weapon in the French arsenal are used, that's the smallest effect you'll get. Now, to your question on scholarship for what? First, we need to confess that past scholarship has scored very poorly. Because, as we discussed and as Azar suggested quite rightly, past discussions of strategic stability and Cold War concepts, because they were coupled with an instrumental understanding of weapons and a worst-case assumption on the enemy views with a long-term cast, the quest for strategic stability ended up justifying the arms race as a lesser evil. And Patrick Morgan has a fabulous study on this. Now, the one thing that past scholarship has done very well is show us 3 things. One, there is, if we remain at the level of discourse, massive internal contradictions in nuclear weapons stock. Second, the causes for weapons acquisition, development, and deployment, and the justifications of weapons acquisition, deployment, and development do not match. Mismatch between causes and justifications. 3, there is a continued inconsistency between leaders' talk, doctrines, targeting policies, and existing arsenals. That scholarship, long before us, has established. And some of the policy talk and some of the invitation to dialogue neglects all of that and assumes that causes and justifications are the same, that this is all consistent, but no, it's not. And so one of the things that scholarship can do is essentially speak to those contradictions, those tensions, and see what they do. At Nuclear Knowledges, what we claim is that the reason why this hasn't been tackled more forcefully before is because a lot of the expert discourse produced is essentially dependent on stakeholders, funding, and worldviews. So the bet I took when I moved to Paris was that I refuse government funding, I refuse Ministry of Defense funding, and I refuse anti-nuclear activism funding. And basically we get funding only based on academic excellence. And based on that, we can engage with policy discourse in the nuclear problem, not by being committed to elements of language, but by treating them as problems. So we are fundamentally detached from official communication, and we avoid this repetition and circularity. And I think in a way, I would hope this is useful for anyone. Because all of you have experts in-house that are busy being committed to refining government language. You don't need scholars to do that. You have your own staff. What we do is something different, right? So we identify those contradictions as spaces for political intervention. And we'll talk more about that. Finally, we reveal and test underlying assumptions on history, on the other side's memory, on public opinion. And let me give you an example about why that's not just Benoît being happy with himself. Everyone for 30 years, I would say, almost, okay, someone is going to piggyback. Almost everyone for 30 years has agreed that, yeah, the closest we got to nuclear war is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So if that's the case, we should kind of care about what that was about. And so what we now know is that for 30 years, the best we knew about the Cuban Missile Crisis was a massive underestimation of the danger. Why? Because Ted Sorensen was committed to President Kennedy, and in the name of his loyalty, essentially underestimated some of the dangers. So we needed scholarship 30 years later to clear the deck about how dangerous the most important event in the nuclear age was. And that's what scholarship can do for you. Reassessments and assessments of the danger of overconfidence. And I'll stop here.
Thank you. The scholarship question for Heather brings in the question of polarization. And I know, Heather, you and others have talked about this quite a lot. It comes up in much of the discourse at the NPT PrepCom recently. The situation is very polarized. We have to do something about the polarization. What can we do? But is it the role of scholarship to avoid polarization? What can scholarship contribute here? And should we be trying to avoid polarization? Would it not be good if the polarization adequately reflects the situation and the politics and what has to be addressed?
Sure. First off, polarization is inevitable because people will always disagree and take different perspectives. So to some extent, I'm not saying we rule it out altogether. But the role of scholarship and academics like Benoît and I, and whether or not we engage in polarization or any political debates for that matter, it really depends on the scholar. To get academic-y about it, I do qualitative empirical research, which, not imperial, even though I like that. I just watched Rogue One, so I think that was in my head. Anyways, I do qualitative empirical research, which basically means I go out and I interview a lot of policymakers, diplomats, and NGOs. And I try to observe trends and get a sense of what does the nuclear field look like right now. But I will also fully admit, this might be where I differ from Benoît a little bit in our approaches to scholarship, is I used to work in government. And what some of you in this room might know is when you work in government, I'm gonna guess you don't have a ton of spare time. You probably don't have people sitting around who can do in-depth empirical research on your behalf, and even if they do, you probably don't have a lot of thinking time to process all of it. This is a role where I think scholars and other NGOs and think tanks can play a really important role, is to collect original data and put it into a useful context, which hopefully can have some policy impact. So I can only speak for myself, but based on my research and work that we've been doing at King's, we have observed, no surprise, growing polarization within the NPT between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. This polarization has always existed, but it is certainly getting worse in recent years. That's due to both the slowing pace of nuclear disarmament, but also to initiatives such as the Ban Treaty and other factors. As an academic, but also as a private citizen, I consider this polarization to be pretty dangerous. I believe in the NPT. I think that a world with the NPT is a safer one, and therefore I would hate to see my scholarship contribute to that polarization anyway. It risks undermining trust and also risks undermining opportunities for progress within the NPT, such as risk reduction, such as incorporating humanitarian concerns, such as trying to develop more responsible deterrence doctrines. And I do believe that at PrepCom, polarization certainly could be observed, but this was my 9th NPT meeting, and this was probably the best atmospheric since 2012. So it's getting slightly better. To be clear, it kind of all went downhill on the last 2 days, and I don't think necessarily it'll carry over to RevCon. But I do think that states, parties in particular to the NPT, recognize the risks of polarization and are taking measures to try to find common ground and to try to talk to people on the other side. And I would also put out there that one opportunity for this could be the U.S. Creating the environment for nuclear disarmament approach. And I would certainly hope that P5 members, but also members of the Nuclear Ban Treaty get involved in that. I also would hope that scholars and NGOs get involved, but I'm pretty sure that they won't be invited to the first meeting. So.
Yeah, that's interesting about the creating the environment process, because I also wondered about the role of scholars and NGOs. Hasn't been much information about that. Perhaps just for the sake of time, we'll stick with you, Heather, because it really follows on very well what you were just saying. How can nuclear possessors engage with Ban Treaty supporters, civil society and other groups that reject nuclear deterrence?
So as you could probably tell that I lunged for the microphone, I'm really happy we got to this question, because I think this is really important. How can the P5 or states under the extended deterrence, extended nuclear deterrence engage with the Ban Treaty? I would say respectfully on both sides. And again, I think that the recent PrepCom showed some initial efforts in that direction. There were much fewer comments criticizing the Ban Treaty than at past PrepComs. So I think that's an important start. But I would also point to 2 initiatives that I think are trying to walk the walk and talk more respectively about the ban. The first would be actually the House of Lords inquiry that I was involved in. We got evidence from, I think, almost maybe 50 pieces of evidence. That included Beatrice Finn, Alexander Clement, many other supporters of the Ban Treaty, along with government officials. And evidence we got from both sides of the issue all said, can we please talk more respectfully about the Ban Treaty and with Ban Treaty supporters? And that made it into the final report as well. And the report itself tries to deal with the ban in a very measured and respectful way, while stating the United Kingdom is probably not going to join anytime soon. The second example I would point to are actually risk reduction initiatives. If you think of risk as consequence times probability, you have to talk about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. That is an essential part of any risk calculation. that is an area where ban treaty members and also NGOs that support the ban treaty, I think, should be involved in these discussions and build on the Humanitarian Impacts Initiative movement. You know, I actually think it's very tragic that the humanitarian conferences ended with the ban treaty. There's a lot more research and engagement to be done on this issue that, unfortunately, it just kind of fell off. But specific topics might include increasing awareness and education. I also think that, you know, ban treaty supporters say that the ban treaty isn't supposed to undermine the NPT. Let's take them at their word. The NPT is not the correct forum for discussing the ban treaty, and I think that was also evident at PrepCom. And as I said, I hope that ban treaty members can join the CE&D approach. But at the same time, I also want to flag what's probably going to be the biggest challenge for everything that I've said today, which is lingering distrust around the word humanitarian. And in this sense, for many nuclear weapon states, they felt betrayed, that the humanitarian movement turned into the ban treaty. They felt lied to. And therefore, anything associated with the word humanitarian is going to bring up those past experiences. At the same time, I can understand that many non-nuclear weapon states and ban treaty members also feel distrust, particularly because nuclear possessors didn't participate in the humanitarian movement until the end. And so the only solution that I have for this is having discussions in forums like this and trying to get the two sides to engage more with each other.
I was just been thinking a little bit about that, because I think that's a very valid point about the nuclear weapon states being, felt they were misled or tricked or lied to about the humanitarian consequences initiative, if we can call it that, because they didn't participate, I think, at least in some cases, because they felt that it would, or they suspected that it would indeed lead to a ban treaty, which it did. But that's happened now, so presumably it's no longer a risk, and this humanitarian word can be used without that danger, because the danger has passed. But we can discuss that later. Benoît, what are your thoughts on how is it possible to build bridges between ban treaty supporters and opponents, and how can nuclear possessors engage with ban treaty supporters, civil societies, and other groups that reject nuclear deterrence?
Right. So let me do just a little detour about maybe about the point Heather made on increasing awareness and education, because I think, interestingly, that's a book. I mean, I don't know anyone who's against it, right? So if you think about increasing awareness and education, so the idea here is one of the things that I think scholarship is interested in, because there is a part of discourse, and that's going to get me to the engagement versus kind of polarization issue. So we've talked about the material dimension of vulnerability. We've talked a little bit about luck and the epistemic risk of overconfidence. There's also a political dimension to it, which is precisely what do people know about nuclear weapons-related things, and what are their attitudes? And so I hear a lot of politics of numbers, essentially. The ban treaty side, they say, oh, 122 states. And the other ones, they say, oh no, you have 57, or, I mean, I've heard multiple numbers, share of the world population that's protected by nuclear weapons. So, interestingly here, you can make majorities in really different ways. And just doing a little bit of analysis is interesting, because it's indeed 54% of the world population in a nuclear weapon state or under a nuclear umbrella, granted. But if you want to claim the world population, then look at different indexes for freedom. If you look at Freedom House, you go down to 31%. If you're not happy with the way Freedom House measures freedom, which you may well not be, The Economist measures it in a way that leads to 3.7%. So claiming world public opinion just by the fact that nuclear weapons are in their state is odd for this reason, which is a lot of those states are not democracies, so we can't claim people know. But most importantly, we need to remember that nuclear weapons are governed by guardianship. So there's no choice being given. And here I would say Switzerland in the 60s and the UK throughout most of its history are the exceptions. But we have no post-Cold War data outside the US. We have pretty good data on the US public opinion attitude. So then as a scholar, what do? We precisely observe a first contradiction, which is claims about people's attitudes are they're ignorant, we need to educate them, they don't care, they should care, and they don't protest like they used to in the 80s, therefore we should treat them as support. The first problem is this is incompatible. If you really think they're ignorant and careless, their voice should not count as support. If you think they support, then you should see what they actually want. So why don't we ask? We did ask through a survey of 7,000 EU citizens across 9 states, quite representative, conducted in June of 2018. And so what we find, just in terms of do nuclear weapons make you feel safe? You have 48.4% of the respondents saying no, like flat out no, and 40.9% saying any shade of yes, from yes to yes and no if it's our weapons, I'm afraid of the other people's weapons, to yes, but it's risky. So we can't, even when we get data, we can't flat out say yes, actually people do feel protected. That's flat out wrong, and scholarship can prove that it's wrong. The other thing that I will not show you, but if you're interested, I'm happy to share this data, is that we have a question about which countries do possess nuclear weapons. And so you would be surprised that, but in France, more than 30% of respondents don't take their own country. And in the UK, it's 15 to 18, which is still high. The other interesting thing, under 23% of respondents across the board cite India and Pakistan. More than 40% cite Iran as possessing nuclear weapons now. So that tells us something on if we want to do bridge building with education and awareness, maybe that's a place to start. Then, in terms of the bridge bit, I think I'm going to propose 2 things. But I think really the problem is currently the bridge building, and that's not, I should say the policy talk about bridge building is essentially an understatement of the internal contradictions of nuclear discourse in the idea that, oh, suddenly people will say the right words and that will mean that they do the right thing. Really? So is everyone becoming a Habermasian? Like, is everyone forgetting about power play? Like, probably not. So then what that does is essentially that's going to create a halfway house that's going to water down a fundamental challenge to nuclear deterrence. And if that's the outcome we want, great, then let's do it. But this is likely to be the effect. And the reason why I say that, I'm going to just give you 3 pieces of evidence. Scholars like me are boring, we read. So the fact is, Ambassador Ford, if you read everything he's written in the last 10 years, you know that he's fundamentally and honestly opposed to disarmament. So to me, it's quite vocal to appoint someone like him to say, oh, we're going to actually create the conditions. Interestingly, our colleague Rebecca Gibbons has published a piece showing how the US does hegemonic coercion to basically bring everyone to fall into line. And she has another piece coming up that I kind of had to discuss at ISA. In terms of language, the shift from creating the conditions to creating the environment is getting increasingly vague. And that's the third piece of evidence for why the US version of bridge building seems to me that like power politics. So what do I propose? 2 things. Beyond the education, which is before we educate people, please let's ask them what they know and what they want, because so far we don't know that. A second proposition would be just a freeze of modernization processes. Why do I use that? Just because if you think of the deterrence camp as a nuclear eternity camp, which is we're going to perpetualize our arsenals for longer than we've had them, all the way to 2080, 2090. So we say, okay, this camp is what I call nuclear eternity. And the other camp is nuclear abolition. So then the freeze isn't in between. Because if nuclear weapon states are worried about losing the capacity, losing the knowledge, just a freeze doesn't take that away. The second bit is that if there is a loss of trust or loss of confidence that nuclear weapon states mean it when they say we want to work towards a world without nuclear weapons, that would be a way. That would be a way to say, wait, we're not just doing, let's talk more so that in the meantime modernization actually happens. So that would be one way of saying we actually mean it. We mean to have a conversation that doesn't just maintain the existing state of nuclear weapons in the world. The other suggestion, which is exactly in line with what we talked about, and I think with some of what Heather said in terms of the dangers of the current postures, which is learn more from past cases of overconfidence. And so what I said about Block was about that. Like, we still have we have a large record of past mishaps in the US and in the UK. We have a pretty bad record of what went wrong in any other nuclear weapon state so far. And it's very likely that things have gone wrong. Because I'm based in France, I'm working on the French case, and we discovered things. That would be another effort to actually say, okay, let's share not just happy moments of what we did right, but why don't we share all the things we really did terribly badly so that we don't do it again? Those would be my two suggestions.
Okay, Heather, one more go before we open up for questions from the audience. Final thoughts on bridge building, challenges for bridge building, obstacles, ideas, specific proposals. You made a couple already, but any further thoughts?
Just a couple. When I think of bridge building, I'm thinking about trying to harmonize humanitarian and security approaches. And as I said, I kind of think we're already seeing efforts at that, such as the UNIDIR study and other studies. And much of what I say, about the need for awareness and education and bringing in humanitarian concerns is also largely informed by my own personal experience, which was I used to work for the US Department of Defense, and then I worked at Chatham House and I started going to the humanitarian impacts conferences. I had been working on nuclear issues for about 10 years at that point. I had never heard the information that was related to those conferences, particularly the Norway conference, which was very facts-based. I had never heard the testimony of survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I had never seen what happens to a human body in a nuclear explosion. That type of education and awareness really is fundamental and needs to be part, I think, of international curriculum on these issues. It's also something that I don't know if diplomats or current military personnel go through that sort of training, but it seems like it should be a prerequisite if you're working on nuclear issues to understand what they actually do. I don't necessarily believe that's going to change deterrence policies, but that's the type of education awareness that I really do think would be quite beneficial. From the nuclear weapons perspective, I think it would also help to do bridge building so that they have a richer understanding of just how deep the frustration is about lack of progress towards disarmament. I think also for the non-nuclear weapon states and supporters of movements like the Ban Treaty, I think if you're serious about disarmament, you have to work with the other side. You have to try to understand why these states still believe that nuclear weapons deterrent are essential to their security. So I think there's benefits to be had on both sides. With that said, I also do recognize that the biggest criticism of bridge building is that it's just not enough, that it isn't actually being done in good faith, that it isn't going to lead to tangible progress towards disarmament. I have yet to hear any other realistic, practical possibilities put on the table that could bring together a diverse group of participants, particularly the states that actually possess the weapons.
Okay, thank you both. Let's open up the floor. Colleague from Iran, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. thank you very much for this informative meeting. As regards to the issues, I would also like to just thank the panelists for their very useful remarks. I think one of the questions which is very much missing is regarding the JCPA, because it is directly linked to nuclear disarmament issue. Although we think this accord has been concluded in the framework of the confidence building measures, but in other narrations it was concluded in 2015 between Iran and 5+1. I mean to say 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. JCPOA is very important because it could settle down an issue which took almost decades, and it had a very good ending by peacefully and diplomatically. Now we are facing the challenges regarding JCPOA. There is a multilateral approach regarding JCPOA which says we should keep this accord alive and workable. But there is also another unilateral approach, mostly by the US, plus 2 or 3 other small and big countries and entities, which they don't want to see JCPOA. JCPOA could be it has a possibility and capability and potential to be an example for dispute settlements in all levels, regional and even international. But to a big surprise, now JCPOA is facing a lot of difficulties. And with the withdrawal of the USA from JCPOA, my main question is which one we should take? We should take the unilateral approach towards these kind of settlements, or do we have any other alternatives for JCPOA? Or is it a good practice, for example, every administration can come and just withdraw from an international accord which has been endorsed by UN Security Council Resolution 2231. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good questions. Yeah, we'll take 2 more. Japan and then Vanessa.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and the 2 panelists. I'm trying to speak on behalf of myself, not on behalf of Japanese government. I'm Japanese missions. Well, I'm very excited to hear about the nuclear deterrence together with the other days CD plenary, because to me, when we hear nuclear deterrence, it's like a religion. Either you believe deterrence or you don't believe, you deny. So I think it's a bit high time for us to break down the concept of nuclear deterrence, or rather disassemble the concept of nuclear deterrence. As far as I know, there are 2 big concepts of nuclear deterrence. One is deterrence by denial, so denial capability, and the other is the deterrence by punishment, so punishment capability. For example, is it really we need the punishment capability? I'm just provoking, I'm not thinking on behalf of government, but and also when it's come to the denial capabilities, traditionally we have a kind of a more, traditional concept is how to defend ourselves, how to deter the attacks by nuclear weapons. But now it seems to be a more offensive denial capability, like Ms. William mentions the risk of attacking, cyber attacking to the command and control system. Isn't it important for us to restrict these kind of type of deterrence capability? So my question is, how could we discuss these issues in more detail, more academic way, rather than just we believe or not? Thank you.
Thank you. And Vanessa from Australia.
Thanks very much, Richard. I have three kind of brief points or questions. The first is about, there are way too many nuclear weapons in the world, but is it more useful now for us to start talking about types of weapons rather than reduction of numbers, and actually to focus on some of the types of weapons that have the most capacity for destabilization? And I mean like hypersonics and cruise missiles, and maybe even practices or behaviors that are inherently destabilizing, which may be, you don't attack C2 systems or whatever. So I'm just wondering, or practices that have sort of a convergence element. But then I struggle with the whole, because as long, all countries are going to want to keep developing the technology, and how do you actually get some agreements around what is acceptable? So that's the first one. The second one is something I learned recently that I didn't know, was that actually previously with targeting, it used to be when cities were being targeted, you needed far fewer weapons. Because you always sort of think, well, why do US and Russia need so many? But if you're actually going to not target cities, but target military targets, that actually massively expands the number of weapons that you need, particularly if you have extended deterrence. So I just wonder if there's room to have another look at targeting, and whether that makes it, there are more humanitarian implications if you then need to go back to cities. And then Heather, I was really interested in your point about what is a more responsible deterrence doctrine. And I think that's a really important conversation. I think at the moment the conversation around deterrence is very binary. Deterrence necessary, deterrence not necessary. And I think that once you have a conversation around transparency, how can we reduce ambiguity, how can we reduce the role of nuclear weapons, and those dialogues on deterrence you were talking about, you actually get a much more rich conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Vanessa. Well, let's pause there, and Benoît, you don't have to answer every bit of every question, but...
So thank you to all the three speakers. I'll just take, I think, the question on concept unpacking, on types of weapons, and on targeting, because there is one. So I'll start with the end, with the targeting question. And once we move the target, then the weapons requirement change. Absolutely, in principle. Except for the fact that the historical record shows us that this consistency between weapons requirement and targeting, they don't add up. And that comes from the work of David Rosenberg and Lynn Eden. Just to give you a sense, during the Cold War, Moscow itself alone as a city had up to 9 nuclear weapons aimed at it. And you don't need 9. Another example is Jane Nolan did a really good study of how precisely the weapons requirement are produced, and we have multiple examples in which we remove numbers of targets, but the required number of weapons remains. This is where really bureaucratic politics and internal politics trump, no pun intended, the assumption of consistency between, of course, those weapons are meant to serve a strategy. Like, often they serve many other things. That's the first angle. Let's keep in mind this inconsistency, because it's going to play out again. We need to be aware of it, and we need to play against it. Otherwise, we're going to just fall back on, oh, it didn't play out the way we think it will. The second element on concept unpacking. Two answers. At first, I'm glad you care about that. That's not an answer. What's interesting in the concept unpacking is, I think, 2 levels. One, it's different if a delegation believes in something, so I believe I need X weapons to do this, versus I act as though I believe, but what I believe is irrelevant. And there are ways to parse out those two differences. That's one thing that scholarship can do. The second bit is the focus on concepts assumes that concepts matter because they accurately describe reality. So, we need a specialized nuclear language because nuclear realities are special and they need their own categories. What we do is, for example, studying the production and circulation of those categories, how they travel around and what happens to them. So just to give you a notion, which is very fashionable in nuclear talk, mutually assured destruction. You can show, if you look at where it's crafted, where it goes, who uses it, and how it's translated, that the reason why people keep using it, it's not because it's accurate. It's because after 5 years, it internalized contradictions, so it means A and non-A, and it ends up meaning everything. So we're essentially trapped inside the category as opposed to being helped with it. And everyone, or at least those who seem to agree on the fact that this is an accurate descriptor, they may actually not agree on the meaning of it. So that's what we can help with is really identifying where the category loses its clarifying virtue and where misunderstandings about that come from. And I'll stop here.
If I could, I'll just say a brief word on each of them because I thought they were all three really helpful questions and comments. To our Iranian colleague, I really appreciate you drawing our attention to this because the JCPOA isn't the only arms control agreement that's at risk or that has fallen apart in recent years. And I particularly appreciate drawing to our attention the benefits, particularly around transparency in agreements such as the JCPOA, and also as forums for dispute settlement. If there are alternatives to the JCPOA, I'll tell you, I have no answer to your questions. I just really wanted to commend that this is an additional risk that we need to be talking about, and not just with regards to JCPOA. The future of New STAR is particularly concerning. To our Japanese colleague on this question about how to have richer discussions about the concepts around deterrence, I'll give 3 opportunities. The first is actually the current P5 process, which I think has potential in that it's, we've been told it's making a lot of progress in talking about transparency of doctrine, but I think that P5 process really needs to open up. And I'm very hopeful that the UK in its leadership of the P5 will invite non-members of the P5 such as India, Pakistan. I think NPDI should absolutely have a seat, and more diverse groups, and again also engaging with NGOs and bringing them into that. Second example would be a specific case. I think Benoît's second bullet point up here about learning from past cases of overconfidence is a great study that could be done. And then the last point I would make is that I'm actually pretty optimistic about how academics are working on deterrence issues. There's really exciting scholarship coming out. I think our problem is we aren't transmitting it effectively to policymakers and diplomats. And if you want suggestions afterwards, I'm happy to give you a list, but just to flag a couple very quickly, Caitlin Talmadge is doing wonderful work on deterrence in East Asia. Austin Long and Brendan Green have looked at numerous historical case studies to unpack where we got deterrence wrong from various perspectives. And Jacqueline Schneider is doing work on deterrence and emerging technologies around deterrence by denial, deterrence by punishment. Again, if anyone wants, I have actually a list of deterrence scholars that policymakers should follow, and I'm happy to send it to anybody. And then lastly, to Vanessa's great questions. First, in terms of, I kind of interpreted your first question as opportunities for arms control around emerging tech a bit. So what a study that I just finished was on kind of the interrelationship of arms control and technology. And there's one really disturbing finding, which I kind of wish I didn't know now, which is historically, arms control works when the technology's development has either plateaued or its utilities dropped off. So, and if you think of the technologies that we're looking at now, we're not even near the plateau. We don't know what these do. Therefore, I think a starting point is we just have to scope this problem I don't think we fully understand yet the risks, or I mean, I don't understand quantum sensing. I'll go ahead and put that out there. But we need to understand these technologies, and particularly how they apply not just to nuclear weapons, but also to conventional weapons as well. But then also, I think we can look at, I have a study, I have an article coming out this in 2 months on asymmetric arms control, where if we can start, because strategic stability, I know that's a contentious term, but strategic stability is becoming much more complex. It isn't just about survivable second strike or nuclear weapons anymore. It's about technological threats to command and control. And so in the study, I look at how you could possibly do trade-offs in that area, and it's meant as just a starting point. But one thing that I'll put out there right now, which I think is could be a great opportunity, is if the P5 process, if the P5 issued a joint statement that they will not use cyber to attack each other's nuclear command and control, and that nuclear weapons will always be put on nuclear weapons will never be put on fully autonomous systems. So there's 2 starting points. And then lastly, with regards to responsible nuclear doctrine, I really do sound like an academic because I did another study on this, and we identify 4 ways that nuclear possessors can be responsible. The first is around transparency and dialogue, but particularly transparency of doctrine. And this is where I really did appreciate the French comment in the CD yesterday, how France has recently released this report about its own doctrine. That is something I think the UK needs to do very, very soon, because there's still confusion around the UK doctrine, for example. Second thing that they can do is continue with nuclear reductions, preferably in arms control. Fourth thing is participation in complying with existing treaties and institutions. And then the last one is the most controversial one. It is investment in the nuclear infrastructure. Because as the custodians of nuclear weapons, you have to keep them safe and secure. And this is a problem where all nuclear spending is often lumped as modernization. Not all modernization is created equal. A new cruise missile is pretty different from paying for better fencing in Los Alamos or something, you know? But if you are going to be a responsible nuclear state, you have to make sure that they are protected from accidents or unintended use.
Okay, thank you. We'll have a few more questions here, and then Renata.
Yeah, thank you, Tora Filson, with the German mission here in Geneva. Now through the mic. Thanks for this very thought-provoking, sometimes mind-boggling conversation. I'm tempted to respond to many of your points, but I will limit myself to a very few. I think we're not going to solve the conundrum about nuclear deterrence and nuclear disarmament today, but I think you have asked a lot of very pertinent questions. And one of the questions we have to ask ourselves when we approach this issue is, has nuclear deterrence worked so far? And I think if we can agree on one answer here, we have already come a long way, because that somehow predefines the way for nuclear disarmament. I'm afraid we have different interpretations here. So if you have some arguments on why nuclear disarmament has not worked, perhaps, I would like to hear them. Because so far I haven't heard a lot of meaningful arguments in this sense. And if nuclear disarmament has worked, and if we have to abandon it through nuclear disarmament necessarily, how can we replace it? So do we need a new kind of sledgehammer to threaten others, or can we create mutual vulnerabilities to replace that in a more threatening, in a less threatening way? I think also your remarks about overconfidence, I think, are very important. It reminded me of our behavior in traffic. Yeah? We all get into our cars and we are convinced that nothing will happen until it happens. And reality shows things will, or worst cases do eventually happen. So I think we should really all remind ourselves of what is at stake here. And I think this is very much important. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to clarify, you said that can we be sure that nuclear disarmament has worked or hasn't worked? I think you meant deterrence.
No, deterrence.
Sorry. Yeah, that was clear from your subsequent comments. Yeah. Thank you. Renata.
Thanks both. That was really interesting and so many different points that it's a challenge to even address them. I had just a couple of reflections. The first was I was really interested, Benoît, when you started, because you had vulnerabilities up, and I liked the word that you were using, because it gets at something that I think wasn't touched on in either of your discussions on deterrence, is the fundamental psychological nature of the exercise. And what's very interesting in our work on deterrence over decades is that an attempt to make concepts seem empirical, factual, ground-based, numbers-based, for what is essentially an exercise in I'm compelling you to believe a certain thing and you're compelling me, and we're in the business of psychological games, and we're playing this game. And I wanted to wonder if there was a bit more unpacking and openness of that fundamental psychological exercise that we're engaged in. Might it offer us a different lens into discussing deterrence and its dilemmas around disarmament? Because you could equally argue that disarmament has a psychological dimension. I can't, and that's the point of Chris Ford's initial article on saying, I will not disarm until I am assured that I have the conditions that meet mine. The implications being, my security and psychological state of mind will be defined only by me, and yours will be only defined by you, and again, therefore, how can we get to a level playing field, or an equal or mutual playing field on every step? So I wanted just to unpack it a little bit. Does some recognition or beginning of openness around the fundamental non-rational, I'm not saying irrational, but non-objective, clean, fact-based nature of this exercise help us, even in restoring a dimension of a recognition of complexity and vulnerability, and some of the points that you pointed to, the inconsistencies in history. And the second issue that I wanted to ask you both to reflect a bit on is this question, is bridge building a step? Can we make any progress? One of the challenges I have with bridge building is that it's a bridge, but it doesn't tell me where I'm getting to. It's great to build a bridge, but a bridge has a purposeful nature of it. So might the discussions around risk and risk reduction be a more fruitful way to frame bridge building? Because we're obviously giving an objective, i.e. we all are agreed to come into this direction, and even if we disagree with the how and what the ultimate objective, it gives us a space to make that practical, to give us a common goal. I wanted just to sort of get your sense whether there was any scope. And then on the modernization point, I don't think it's realistic to freeze modernization, not least because many of the actors involved in many types of new technologies aren't even outside the government sphere, as I controlled use, all the rest. So it's fundamentally different, I think, than some of the Cold War developments where they were very much under the control of state actors, defense structures, and you had to, even if freeze wasn't realistic then, it's certainly less realistic now, and I think we could play more with that, thinking about the differences from the past. But might there be, and that's really to just tease out Heather's interesting points at the end, might there be grounds for what we recognize as statements amongst and between P5 and or other nuclear weapon states, especially ahead of the RevCon, of a recognition of a certain degree of either a minimum commitment to not attack certain structures, recognition of a certain degree of vulnerability. So in other words, that responsible nuclear weapon state policy recognizes the particular challenges faced by new technologies.
Thank you. Let's take one more. Front space and then.
Thank you. So I'm with the French delegation here in Geneva. I'm Amélie Delaroche, for those who don't know me. And I'd like to, first of all, thank the panelists. Thank you for organizing this very interesting debate. I like the way the whole thing was conducted with questions, making it very interactive. So a lot of being said. and I'm speaking here on, more me than really in my national capacity. I think that's also the aim of the exercise. But some of what you've said, some of what the panelists have said, I agree with, some not so much, but it's not, I won't pick up on everything. I'd just like to offer a few comments from my perspective. Perhaps a few elements of information on the P5 process, because I think that's a lot has been said about responsible attitudes of nuclear weapon states, and for the outside world, so to speak, the world outside the nuclear weapon states within the NPT, the P5 process. There's maybe not so much clarity about the process itself, so I'd like to say a few words about the P5 roadmap leading to 2020 and beyond, and the elements on which we're working. First of all, most importantly, there's a lot of work being done on strategic stability dialogue around doctrines. This is not something that's new, but it's certainly something that we want to dig in more. So there are many open conversations there about doctrines, and I think that's very useful. So this is very useful for the P5 itself, but it's useful also beyond the P5, and that's the reason why the P5 is trying to reach out to other partners, among which the NPDI, but also possibly other non-nuclear weapon states. Relating to the dialogue on doctrines, there's a lot of thinking, discussions going on as well on strategic risk reduction. And I know Unidia has done an interesting paper on risk reduction, and this topic has been touched upon as well here. We see this as something, a topic, an area that could be developed more. So how can we, reduce the risks linked to unintended use or intended use of nuclear weapons based on miscalculation, misperceptions? I think that's very important to look at. What do we have? What kind of measures do we have? Where can we do more? Another topic that the P5 is working on is the glossary of terms, because if we don't know what we're talking about, then it's difficult to make progress. So we have to make sure that we have the same understandings on key topics related to strategic stability in general. And then perhaps also a few words on what you said about the humanitarian consequences. I think yes, here I'm talking more for the French side. I don't know so much about the others, but there has indeed been, there is today a sense of wariness clearly for us when we talk about humanitarian consequences, not because we say that there are no humanitarian consequences, certainly they are, but the way we see it, humanitarian consequences, this has directly led to the TPNW, and so it's all this instrumentalization, politicization, I might say, of the humanitarian consequences that we very much regret, because now we're in a situation where it's very difficult to talk about these issues, and I do think it's regrettable. Yeah, so I'll probably stop here. Thanks.
Thanks. Very quickly, Michel, if you could.
Yes, quickly. I'm a member of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, so I speak on behalf of an NGO, if I dare to. I see quite a difference between deterrence and confidence, because deterrence, as gentlemen said, we must believe in deterrence, and I doubt that many people would believe in deterrence. I think it's more bluff, and not so many people really take it seriously in this monstrous effect of nuclear weapons, you know. The confidence is something else. And I think now there are new methods to get confidence. And I just quote the nonviolent communication, for example, which I teach, and restorative circles. The aim of those nonviolent methods is to improve the capacities of countries and people just to see the needs and to listen to the needs of the opponents. And this is very strong. And we have to favor this type of listening and also expressing. If I express my needs, it's important for the others to take it into account. And this, instead of negotiating, I'm stronger in my arguments, that you are weak in your arguments, it doesn't lead to anything, but just to share feeling and needs, it is strong in itself. And there are now new methods to have improved, and I think it would be necessary to rely more on these methods that bring confidence than deterrence, in which I think not so many do really believe in it. But it may still happen that a nuclear weapon will explode, you know. So better to just learn those new methods, nonviolent methods, to bring some confidence between nations. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think we could probably, I mean, that also touches on what Heather was talking about, the House of Lords inquiry with the need for more respectful dialogue. Certainly use that at the NPT in 2020. Thank you very much for that last set of comments. Let me hand to you first, Benoît, to answer them and perhaps some concluding remarks, and then Heather will answer afterwards.
May I still get the slideshow? Because some of the slides that you haven't seen yet are relevant. Thank you. So thank you all. I'm gonna speak to 3 of the points, and if the chair allows me, I'll say something on the risk frame later. So I'd like to speak to the freeze analogy and what good is it. Then obviously the gentleman's question of what do we know, what can we know about whether nuclear deterrence works, and why does that matter? I want to say a few words also on this notion of responsible nuclear statehood, or the words that have been used along those lines. So what I want to show you is this bit. So yes, so that's one of the notions that I hear most often. Nuclear weapons kept the peace since 1945. And so there are 10 reasons scholarship established to show you that you can't say that. Or if you say that, then you're saying something that has been proven wrong. And here, since you're asking specifically about nuclear deterrence, I'm going to give you the 5 reasons why the version of that says because nuclear deterrence works is not adequate. So, as a prelude, I want to speak to your point about psychology in what is it that we bring on that. So, nuclear deterrence scholarship is divided in 4 waves, and the so-called third waves in the late 70s all the way through the 80s is essentially a psychological critique of it, which is being and so same as Heather, I think that her way of doing it is much kind of crispier than mine. So we have a few bullet-pointed versions of what a psychology critique of deterrence is. The interesting bit that has come out recently comes from Rose McDermott, and it's basically saying even the proponents of rational deterrent theory, they believe that retaliation will happen. But wait, if you're hit with a massive nuclear strike, what's the rationality of actually retaliating? It's over. The strategy has failed. And what Rose McDermott shows is that they're inconsistent in believing that retaliation will happen, but they're empirically right because deep down the strategy is based on a psychology of revenge. So the labeling of rational deterrent theory has a revenge underpinning to it that we can unearth. So that's for the psychology layer. Now there's a gentleman on deterrence work. So we have insufficient evidence of intentions to attack. You know, Václav Masny essentially shows by looking at Warsaw Pact scenarios that all of them presume the war started by NATO. So in order to say deterrence has worked, it means that there was something to deter in the first place. Second, the deterrent value of nuclear weapons, that's something that we talked about, cannot easily be separated from the deterrent value of the entire arsenal. So we need detailed case studies on this to see in which cases it was the nuclear component that did the deterrent trick, and in which other cases it worked to the opposite case, and in which cases essentially the outcome was overdetermined. The other thing is doctrines follow arsenals. Rarely is the opposite. And that's something that we miss when we say deterrence works, because we assume that the arsenal was built to serve the doctrine. The intellectual history and the arsenal history shows that doctrines follow arsenal, rarely the opposite, and they're almost never consistent. And the last 2 points, which I think are the most important, and then I'll make a conceptual proposition. One is the equation of peace through deterrence is that there's a threat, and there's an expectation of retaliation and harm. This expectation of retaliation and harm creates fear. Fear creates caution, and then deterrence works, right? So what scholarship shows you is that this equation does not always apply. And one example I'll give you on the fear front is that at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the French have not experienced fear. And this is something you can show, and I've documented in peer-reviewed scholarship. You can see through archival documentation of the Foreign Ministry, the Defense Ministry, the letters to de Gaulle. They should have been afraid, and they were not. Similarly, there is the idea that fear triggers caution. And there, scholarship can also help you. In the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Castro is the one case of intense fear. There is, in Castro at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a sense that the regime is doomed and that the Americans are going to either bomb him or invade. And so the reason of that, the outcome of that, is not caution. It's a letter that we have to Comrade Khrushchev saying, since we're done, please do let us start a nuclear war or start it on our behalf. So you have a case in which the deterrent effect of fear produces a desire to escalate. And that's something that's documented by historical scholarship. And then you're going to tell me, wait, that doesn't apply because this is crazy Castro. Okay, now how about, and it's random and interesting that you're from the German mission, because we looked precisely at Konrad Adenauer. And through German archives and foreign ministry archives, we discovered that Chancellor Adenauer had the same experience of fear at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Similarly, was told that Berlin was at risk, that civil defense was underfunded, the city wasn't protected, they shouldn't escalate. What did Adenauer respond? No. Khrushchev is a drunk who only understands force. We need to escalate. And that's also scholarship under review. So you have another case of nuclear fear that doesn't produce caution. Sometimes it produces the opposite effect. So we can't have a blanket statement that it always produces fear. No, it doesn't. And when it produces fear, it always produces caution, which is what we want. No, it doesn't. The last reason, which takes me back full circle, is that all of this assumes that those are all controlled practices. But as I showed earlier, I hope I did, there are instances in which it did work, but not because of controlled practice, either in spite of them or independently from them. So we can't take credit from those to say it all worked out fine. Conceptual proposition, instead of saying deterrence worked, deterrence didn't work, why don't we say deterrence did not fail catastrophically? Because it failed multiple times without causing a nuclear explosion. Deterrence can fail without causing nuclear explosions. Hypothetical scenario, right? So if Richard and I are in a door, yeah, we're in a deterrence relationship. The point is that Richard, so I hope he will not attack me. That's why the whole posture is there, right? If he decides to attack me, gives the order, but the order isn't passed, or there is a technological malfunction, and the missile doesn't go off. It's a deterrence failure, because he wanted to attack, but it's a deterrence failure that doesn't produce anything, so it's a non-catastrophic failure. So we have ways to show that nuclear deterrence has failed multiple times. What we show is that it hasn't failed in a way that produces a nuclear blast. And those are different propositions. So I'll stop here.
Thanks, Benoît. It's really thought-provoking. Heather, sum us up.
Sure. I will just kind of finish with three points to this question about has deterrence worked, what replaces it. I think in the current security context, that a world without nuclear weapons exists when something quote-unquote better comes along. When something that has the same deterrence value that nuclear possessors currently put on nuclear weapons. I am not convinced that that world is safer than the one that we live in now, because we don't know what that next thing will be, and it's quite scary. But also, I think this gets to, Richard said something at the opening that I thought was a really helpful metaphor, which is, if you think of deterrence, or think of deterrence as the floorboards in the house, that it's incompatible with disarmament because you're pulling out the floorboards while you're standing on them. And I think if we want to take that analogy further, it'd be like, well, yeah, don't pull out the floorboards until you have another house to move into. And right now, we don't have the security environment to pull out more floorboards and move into another house, because that house hasn't, it might not even been starting to be built. And then I was going to make a comment quickly about Renata's point, which I think was really important, about how deterrence is a psychological exercise and the role of vulnerability. And I couldn't help but think about arms control. Because in arms control relationships, both sides are making themselves vulnerable. They can put in as much verification and as much data exchanges as they want. You are still making yourself vulnerable to the other side. There's the risk that they might cheat. There's the risk that they might use inspections to gain information about your arsenal. There's always these vulnerabilities associated with arms control. No matter how much you try to qualify for them, we're always vulnerable in some ways, even if we don't fully acknowledge it. But that's also a relationship where you can maintain deterrence. And I guess that's my final plug for why we need more arms control. But the very final point I kind of wanted to end on was a question that I got at PrepCom, where somebody asked me, if Russia gave up all of its nuclear weapons tomorrow, do you really think that the United States would attack it with nuclear weapons if Russia was fully disarmed? I'm gonna let everyone think about their answer to that one for a second. So if Russia gives up nuclear weapons, would the US use nuclear weapons against a disarmed Russia? My first answer was, I think you should go ask the Russians. And then the second answer was, I kind of flipped it in my head, and I was thinking, well, what if it was the United States that had unilaterally disarmed? Would Russia ever use nuclear weapons against the US? And the answer is, I really don't know, but history would suggest that during a crisis or during a war, Russia would be more likely to seize the strategic advantage and use nuclear weapons against a disarmed United States or its allies than if it faced retaliation, and vice versa. You could flip US and Russia in those points. So I just mean to say that the risks of nuclear possession, they are indeed great, but I'm not yet prepared to say that the risks of unilateral disarmament are any less. And that's a calculation that I really don't think any of us in this room can make with complete certainty. And then my very final point is thank you again so much for doing this. This was a really helpful event, I thought.
Can I do 3
There's always one. All right, very quickly.
Sure.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I apologize because I realized I had promised to say something about responsible nuclear sovereignty and didn't get to it. So, yeah, it's just, to me, this is an important dimension because I would never use the word responsible nuclear sovereignty because that's government speak. And I think legitimizing government speak as analytical category is massively problematic for me. So government can talk all they want about responsible nuclear sovereignty, or for that matter, irresponsibility. That's not what we do. The only thing that scholarship can tell you about this is actually interesting, is there are multiple ways of thinking about responsibility. The current nuclear speak treats that within the framework of stability, non-proliferation, and deterrence. And as I've demonstrated in an article in 2016, that frame of responsibility ends up being responsible vis-a-vis the custodians of the existing nuclear order and vis-a-vis each other as current nuclear states. But given two things, given that one, the world we're in has been built, out of testing and particular choices in the past, the issue is, couldn't we say that we have to be responsible to the memories of all of those who created the current nuclear world? Or, given that we're making bets on 60 to 80 years in the future, shouldn't we say that we're also responsible to those who will carry the consequences of the decisions we're making today? And so, if we're basically stretching this notion of responsibility beyond the really narrow presentist view, the requirements of responsible nuclear sovereignty vary massively. So let's not make quick judgment on that's responsible, that's not responsible. What is talked about as responsible nuclear sovereignty is a narrow presentist view of being responsible towards the existing custodians of the existing nuclear order.
No, I'm good.
All right. Thank you. All right, we're just about out of time, so let's wrap up. Thank you very much for your questions. They've added a considerable dimension to our discussion. There are many more questions we could ask. I have some I thought would come up, but haven't. I mean, I'm always a little bit struck when we talk about deterrence and we get into the nitty-gritty like this, that sometimes forget that there are over 150 states that don't use nuclear deterrence for their security and don't see a need for it. And we could perhaps, in another event, examine why that's different for them. Another question that we haven't really tackled is, I'm interested, Heather took up this thing about the floorboards and, you can't remove the floorboards till you have another house to move into. But that kind of reasoning never seems to be applied to North Korea, for example. North Korea is just expected to ditch its nukes and bad luck if you don't have another house. So these are just some questions to go away with. I don't know the answers to them. What I would like to do before we finish is look at the poll here. So we had 17 votes, is that right, Marion? Yeah. To the question, can bridge building between proponents of nuclear deterrence and the TPNW result in practical cooperation and progress towards shared disarmament goals? 71% say yes, 29% say no. Would anyone like to vote again now? We've finished the discussion. You can do it at your leisure, and we'll tweet out the results.
What if more voters?
Well, we'll have to do some statistical adjustments. All right. Thank you again very much to both our panelists. It was a very stimulating discussion. Thank you for injecting especially your thoughts on what scholarship can offer. These scholars we have here today and their many colleagues are resources that we perhaps should draw on a lot more in our work in Geneva. So if anyone has some ideas about how we can bring academic work to your work as diplomats more effectively, please let us know at the Geneva Disarmament platform. That's something we want to try and do, is build bridges, to use a slightly overworked metaphor. And if there's anything else you would like to see the GDP put on an event for you to help you understand something, to debate something, to analyse something, please do get in touch and let us know. We're very happy to work with any mission, any institution to organise interesting events that we hope will be stimulating and informative for all of us as we go about our business on disarmament in Geneva. So thank you all. Thanks for joining us. We hope to see you next time.
Backup list. I anticipate, like, oh no, because I was like, if I were going to ask me hard questions, what would I ask? I was like, oh, I'll have a few things in mind because I'm not good at thinking on my feet. You know what I mean? And